Welcome to Satsunami.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Satsunami. My name is Adam, and joining me today is the fearless captain of the ship, Satsunami. Satsunami, welcome back.
I didn't really want to interrupt you there, but this ship is sinking. Have you got a spare bucket?
Oh, is that why the carp are swimming about my ankles right now?
Look, why did you name it Titanic? Also, hello everybody. Hope you're doing well.
Well, I guess we better get this episode on on the road then, since we seem to be sinking at an alarming rate. But anyway, so today we're going to be discussing the game What Remains of Edith Finch, developed by Giant Sparrow, published by Annapurna Interactive, and released in 2017. So as a warning before we start the episode, this game deals with some quite serious themes, which we're going to be discussing throughout this episode. So please consider this a kind of content warning for the whole episode. Satsunami, so how did you first hear about Edith Finch?
I think Edith Finch was one of those indie games that constantly pops up. Whenever somebody talks about, I want to play a really entertaining, narrative-driven indie game, usually Edith Finch pops up. It's quite surprising because every time it pops up, I'll say, I'll play it. And Adam, you know my track record for games. When I say, I'll play it, and I never do.
Throw it on the backlog.
Pretty much. That backlog is... Do you know how I treat my backlog? It's like, you know, all those Christmas fires? You know, you throw a log onto it just to fuel the fire. And it's like, yeah, I'll extinguish it someday and bring that log out. I never do. But...
You've just got a chimney, you've just got a fireplace with ash now, basically.
Pretty much.
Smouldering away, just staining your walls.
I'm like, Journey, no. Gone home, no. Firewatch. Oh, well, actually, I did start Firewatch. Nearly made me tear up, I will say that. But anyway, sorry, back to Edith Finch. Yeah, I remember hearing about this game for ages, but much like a lot of the games that I've been told about, I never really looked into it. I never really looked into it to say, is this what Edith Finch is about? Is this the kind of gameplay we're getting into? I don't really like going into games and knowing everything about them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you want a bit of mystery still.
Yeah, especially for indie games, because indie games are so rich and diverse, and you get such an entertaining amount, especially for, and you name dropped them earlier, with Annapurna Interactive, who have become my fast-growing favourite publishers currently, because I've been playing a lot of games from them. And again, I know there's a difference between publisher and developer, but, you know, they've published a lot of games that, quite frankly, have caught my interest recently. I think they published Firewatch as well. Could be wrong on that. They also published Telling Lies, Last Stop. So when I saw Edith Finch was on Game Pass recently, I thought, you know what? Let's give it a go, because I know, of course, you, Adam, you had recommended this game quite a lot to me, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to do it. It's free on Game Pass. I'm going to jump in, I'm going to play it, and it was a great experience. But I've got to turn the question back on you, because you have non-stop been telling me about this game. You've been saying how amazing it is. So what was your exposure to it in the first instance?
Yeah, I think I only recommended it to you about 500 times, maybe conservatively.
Probably the same amount of times I recommended Castle Crashers to you.
No, we're certainly, I think, rivaling each other for that. But no, so I heard about this game. So I said it came out late April 2017. Actually, the day we were recording this, it is nearly the 5-year anniversary of this game. So I said it came out late April 2017. I don't think I heard about it until the end of 2017, because Edith Finch, this game won the best game at the BAFTAs in early 2018, and it was getting a lot of buzz sort of, you know, as 2017 wore on towards the end of it. And that's when I think I first heard it mentioned. It sounded really intriguing, and I was really keen to get it. So I saw that it's always been quite well priced, because it's a relatively short game. So I just decided to splash out and pick it up. And so I played it at the end of 2017, and I instantly fell in love with it. It's still one of my favorite games of all time. It's in my top 5 best games ever. I absolutely love it. And yeah, I've recommended it to about every living creature I think I've come into contact with in the intervening 5 years. But yeah, so it was a game that really lived up to the hype, for me certainly anyway. So I'm just glad that it seems to have certainly resonated with you at least, and it hasn't been a complete flop.
Well, I mean, considering the fact that I kept spamming you non-stop with like theories and pictures of the game, being like, now Adam, Listen, okay? See this log outside? It's the key to all
It
this.
means something.
It's the key to the curse, damn it. Edie was alive the entire time.
You're making the Finch house out of mashed potatoes.
That's it, I'm going to the Finch's house.
I don't think any of us expected him to say that.
Oh, it is just such a deep game, though, because I remember the first time I actually played this game, and I remember messaging you saying, yeah, it's good. Yeah, I played it, because I was on a bit of an indie game binge, and I played it, I loved the art style and everything, and then after finishing it, I was kind of like, okay, I like it, but I'm a bit confused about certain elements. And then, of course, you were explaining some things, and after looking it up again, I was like, okay, it actually made me want to go back and replay it through a second perspective. I don't think I've played many games like that where I've actively wanted to go back and replay the exact same game. Was that your experience, Adam, when you first played through this game?
Oh yeah, I really wanted to go back up to this. And it's funny as well because, as you say, it's not often the minute you finish a game you instantly want to go back and replay all of it, certainly. Sometimes maybe you want to go back and revisit a section of it. But it's especially as well for a game that, this game doesn't change. The story's always the same, the gameplay doesn't change at all. So you are literally just retracing the exact same steps again. But it's so rich, as you say, and it's so rewarding, and you can find so much more just in the environment and in the story on subsequent playthroughs that it's really a rewarding experience to go back to it. So I completely agree with you on that about just instantly wanting to dive back into it again. I think I might have played it maybe nearly once every year since it came out, because it's a short experience, and if I'm just looking for that, if I'm looking for something very thoughtful and a bit somber, a bit melancholic, then this it's absolutely perfect. There's no better experience in my mind.
I'm actually surprised you go back once a year, because this is a very, as you alluded to with your content warning, of course, it is a very dark game.
Yeah, there's a lot in this. This is very much, I would say, a mature game. And I don't mean the kind of M for mature. I mean, this is very serious themes are discussed in this game and brought up. But I guess part of the reason I like it so much as well, because in many ways, this is, as much as it's a game, I think it's as much an experience, and I think it really gets you thinking. And that seems to have been your experience as well. This seems to have really kind of got you thinking about the game itself and about its themes and what it's bringing up and what it's talking about. And I think that's the real strength of that. It's a real kind of piece of art in a way. I think that's why I keep coming back to it.
You could say it's a piece of art drawn in a tree trunk.
You could say that. Very good. Very, very good.
Oh, I'm going to hell for that joke, but yeah.
So the melancholy begins. Not with a bang, but with a whimper.
If I didn't make jokes like that, honestly, I think I'd be crying, because
yeah,
as we were discussing there, half of the deaths in this game, or rather, I should probably say endings, as it were, but it is just a lot to take in. It's just, you sit there after, and there's one particular character, which you know who I'm talking about, but I won't, disclose who I'm talking about, but it's one character you play through as, and you just sit there and you think, why? Wow, why? And it is just that kind of emotive experience. And you're right, this whole game is just an experience. That almost sounds like a bit of a buzzword, doesn't it? To be like, it's just an experience, but it really is, isn't it?
Oh, it completely is. As I said, that's why I was funny about calling it a game. It is a video game, there's no denying it, but it doesn't resemble it in that kind of a video game in so many ways. Experience is the term that I think is much better to describe going through this. So yeah, it bucks the trend, I feel, so much from kind of maybe a more classic video game.
Yeah, I was going to make another joke when you said bucks the trend, but I'd rather not.
My goodness. I kind of agree with you. We have to laugh or we have to cry. We're going to do one of the two things. So
I have to admit, before obviously we jump into it, you know that way when you watch something, in the anime world, I think JoJo's Bizarre Adventures is used for this, but it's every time you go around, you'll see something very common, and anime fans will say something like, oh, is this a JoJo's reference? But I've been walking around, the shops and things, and looking at something completely normal, and all I can think of in my head now is this a Edith Finch reference? It's like, clearly not, but that's honestly how impactful this game's become for me. Everywhere I look, I'm like, Edith Finch, Edith Finch.
It's everywhere. It's like the Matrix.
It's like, you know those old memes where it's like, eating toothpaste? That's an Edith Finch reference.
My God. Well, you can see the effect this game's had on both of us. So just say we are going to be spoiling the story of this game. So if you haven't played What Remains of Edith Finch, I'm going to speak for both of us here. I think we both highly recommend that you pause the episode, go and get a copy of it if you can. As I said, as Satsunami said, it's on Game Pass, so if you have access to that, it's a perfect place to try it out. And then once you've played it won't take you long. Come back and you can hear our thoughts on the game and its themes. So before we dive into the game, then let's pause for a little minute and hear some adverts. So we'll see you on the other side.
Welcome to Satsunami, a variety podcast that talks about topics from gaming and films to streaming and general interests.
Previously on Chatsunami, we discussed Game of the Decade, Deadly Premonition, the romantic thriller Birdemic, and listen to us get all sappy as we discuss our top 5 Christmas films.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can find us on Anchor, Spotify, YouTube, and all good podcast apps. As always, stay safe,
Stay awesome, and most importantly,
stay hydrated.
We are Beer and Chill Podcast.
Podcast where we review TV shows, games, movies, and whatever else takes our fancy.
So what are you waiting for? If you're a cool kid like us, you're gonna listen to the Beer and Chill Podcast. You can get it anywhere from Spotify all the way to your grandmother's radio. My name is Jan.
And I'm Craigie C.
And we are
Beer and Chill.
So Satsunami, before we kind of dive properly into the game here, can you give us the kind of Cliff Note summary of What Remains of Edith Finch?
So, What Remains of Edith Finch is a uplifting story about a happy-go-lucky... Okay, no, sorry, I can't do it.
Got the wrong notes there, I think.
Wait, we're not talking about Tunic? No.
No.
The one with the fox? No. Oh.
I mean, there's so many similarities. Having not played Tunic, I'm sure there's so many similarities.
Me neither, actually. I thought, what's a new game with a happy-go-lucky character?
It's just like insert popular game right now here.
So, yeah, What Remains of Edith Finch is the story of a young woman called Edith Finch who goes back to her family home and she decides to explore her family history. She learns about each individual dating back from her grandmother all the way down. Or sorry, is it her great-grandmother?
I think it's a great-grandmother, yeah.
Great-grandmother, sorry. I skipped a generation there. Yeah, her great-grandmother all the way down to herself. And she kind of works through every family member, finding out how they died. Some more brutal than others, of course. And it's just this very... I'm going to borrow a phrase from past Satsunami here, but it's a very emotive experience. It's one that takes you through basically a roller coaster of emotions. And I know that sounds so cliche to be like, oh, it's an emotive experience, oh, any game can be like that. Red Dead Redemption was like that. You know, it's like, no, it's completely different. Basically, you're kind of put on a set of rails. And as you alluded to, Adam, the fact is the story is never going to change. Despite your actions or the way the story progresses, it's always going to end up the same. And there's a kind of sense of like futility every time you play through because you know how it's going to end. Do you know what it actually reminded me of? Have you ever seen the Doctor Who episode, Adam? And this might sound very, very niche, but have you seen the Doctor Who episode where they go to Victorian London and it's Christopher Eccleston who meets Charles Dickens?
I was watching Doctor Who when Christopher Eccleston was the Doctor. I don't recall that episode, though, I have to admit.
I think it was the third episode. It's like where all the ghosts are coming out the lab.
I can't remember that one, unfortunately.
I have to admit, it wasn't one of the stronger ones. No offence to the writers, but I remember there's a particular line in that which actually makes me think of Edith Finch to a T. And I know now I'm turning everything into an Edith Finch reference, but in that episode, of course, the Doctor and his companion, Rose Tyler, they end up meeting Charles Dickens and they stop all these ghosts. They have like this big adventure. And then when they go back to their spaceship, the TARDIS, Rose says to the Doctor, will this not like mess up the timeline that Charles Dickens is going to write about all of these, alien encounters and all these ghosts, when obviously he hasn't written about them? And the Doctor kind of shrugs and he goes, oh, don't worry, because in a couple of months it's reported that he died. So she goes, oh, that's a shame. And I think he turns around and he says something like, oh, well, before you met him, he was already dead. So it's like, although you're getting invested in these characters in Edith Finch, and although Edith herself is getting invested in like her family history, there's kind of that inevitability that although she's diving into the shoes of those characters, they're already dead. They're already gone on. It's just quite a sobering experience. Anyway, sorry, I know that was a long-winded tangent there, but it kind of summarises it perfectly of how, even though all these people are long gone within the story and the narrative, there's still that kind of personal touch, if that makes sense. But sorry, I hope I summarised that okay.
Can I just say how frustrating it is that by this point in the Satsunami run, I must have done at least 5 times as many summaries as you've done. Yeah, even though you've done far fewer, you can speak with such eloquence and so perfectly summarise these games. And I still struggle to summarise the plot of Halo or of Starship Troopers. So it's incredibly frustrating for me, but that was an excellent summary and a perfect jumping off point for us. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to divide the core of this episode into 2 kind of major areas. We're firstly going to talk about the game itself, and then we're going to dive into more of the themes that kind of permeate through the game. So turning to the game first of all, what did you think first of all of the story as a whole? And secondly, what did you think of the way it was told? Because as you've said, Edith is diving into the memories of her ancestors, siblings, and it's divided into these kind of short stories. So what did you think of both the way it was divided up and also kind of the narrative as a whole?
This honestly sounds like a bit of a cop-out, to be honest, to say like, oh, you only get it if you play through it a second time. But I remember I played through it the first time, and there were certain elements that I was a little bit confused at. So for example, with Molly's story where she transforms into all the creatures and there's all this talk about the Finch curse and everything, I genuinely thought we were getting like a paranormal kind of story. Not in a bad way, because I've played my fair share of cookie games, especially with Deadly Premonition, as you'll be able to attest to, Adam, as well. That game goes some places.
That's conservatively putting it.
Exactly. So when I first played through it, there were some stories that didn't really hit the same. Like, especially with Walter's story or Barbara's story, it's like if you take these stories at face value, they make absolutely no sense. But if you peel away the kind of surface level of them and you look underneath about what these stories are implying, my God, you get a completely different experience. And I do like the fact that you have to kind of explore the house and you have to look and see who was who. You have to actually go through their bedrooms and see what kind of person they were before they died. It's really fascinating. And you get some morbid imagery. For example, there's 2 characters who are the sons of the matriarch of the Finch family. That, of course, being Edie Finch. And Edie Finch is a weird character, and I'm sure we'll get onto her. But long story short, Calvin ends up dying at a young age, and we see that Calvin and Sam, these 2 boys, once shared a room, and it's divided kind of in half. So on one side, you've got Sam's room, where Sam's got all of these paraphernalia for the army, the military, that kind of things, because he loved being a soldier, whereas his brother was more into being a spaceman. So, his is all like, it's covered in rockets, helmets, that kind of thing. But then, as soon as Calvin passed away, it's kind of roped off. And you think, okay, when you're first playing through it, you think nothing of it. You just think, okay, I'm getting from point A to B to the next story, let's progress this. But when you go back and visit it, you realise that this poor boy, his brother Sam, had to live beside that room until he was 18, just looking at this velvet rope. stopping them from getting to the other side. It's like a lot of show don't tell kind of storytelling, which I really appreciated in this, because I found myself, and I don't usually do this a lot in games, but I found myself exploring a lot of the environment and trying to see what does this contribute to the story, because as I was saying to you before we started, I replayed through this again and I was just writing notes down like nobody's business, and it's just amazing to see what you can find when you actually look closer at the background. But did you feel the same way, Adam?
Yeah, see, it's funny because when I first played this, so before I played this one, I played another kind of, what Remains of Edith Finch kind of fits into the walking simulator genre of games, and I'd played a game called Gone Home not long before, which is very much of the same ilk. And Gone Home has you kind of, as your main character exploring the kind of family home. And so when I started playing What Remains of Edith Finch, I thought it was going to be very similar. I thought we were going to explore around the Edith, the Finch house, and we were going to, uncover the story there. But once we started kind of going into the stories, it really grabbed me, and I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And then it varied things up, and visually they're quite different, all the stories and stuff. And I found it a really, really effective way of storytelling. It's something that really kind of grabbed me and drew me in. And then, as you say, I love the fact that then you'll play a story and then you go back to kind of exploring the house, and it recontextualizes a lot of things. And even more so when you have subsequent playthroughs and the main story and the kind of each character's, what happens to each character, you can begin to look at the house in a different kind of way. So I really love it. I think it's a really good way to tell a story. And it's funny because it makes me kind of all things, it makes me think back to when we discussed Sonic Adventure, the first Sonic Adventure a month ago, however long ago it was we did that. I kind of mentioned that I didn't like the way its story was told, and it kind of the game's divided up into chapters as well. And I thought that kind of muddled the main story. But I think having this structure in Edith Finch is actually much more effective than if it had purely been you kind of exploring the house and there was no kind of delving into each character's past. So I really like it. So I really agree with you as well. There's an excellent mix between straight up narrative, but also environmental storytelling, and the two combine really, really effectively. I just think it's excellent. So kind of looking at the stories, was there a story when you first played through, was there a character story that particularly grabbed you at the time? And then has there been one, since you've played the game twice now, has there been one that on the second playthrough you got a lot more from?
First of all, can I just say, maybe this is again go back to your content warning, but Gregory's story never gets less shocking whenever you play it. So of course, for anyone who maybe might not remember who I'm talking about, Gregory is probably the youngest character you play as, who is literally just a baby in a bathtub, and the implication is that the baby drowned in the bathtub, but it does it in such a way that it's colourful, it's bright, it's, you've got the classical music, the triumphant waltz, I want to say, is this cartoon frog is jumping around, or toy frog. I remember playing through a lot of the stories thinking, oh, they're going to all end the same way. That, of course, being each character you play as is going to die at the end. But with Gregory's character, as soon as I became a baby in a bathtub, I think I messaged you immediately, Adam, and I was like, Adam, am I playing as a baby right now? Adam?
Please tell me this one has a happy ending.
Yeah, I'm like, Adam, please. And then I saw what was happening as it was bouncing towards the lever, and I was like, oh no. Other than that, one of the ones that I feel as if I got really invested in researching was Lewis's story. So Lewis is the brother of the protagonist of this game, Edith, and he is basically your kind of stereotypical gamer / a victim of substance abuse, because you can tell he's very proud of a lot of things. Like, obviously he's into his games, he was into a lot of fantasy, and it wasn't until I actually went back and played his story that I was quite interested in a couple of things in his room. So, for example, and this is me bringing up my notes, by the way, just in case anyone's like,
bring them out.
Heck is he doing? Yeah, I was quite curious when I went into his room. Of course, being a gamer myself, I was like, oh, what kind of console has he got? And it looks more like a PlayStation 1, but what it's actually called in the game is a Wonderland console. So a bit like Alice in Wonderland. And that is emphasised by a book that he's got called The Red King's Dream, which is lying beside it, who is also a character in the book Through the Looking Glass. And if you look at his other books. He's got books like, of course, Through the Looking Glass, Peter Pan, quite fantastical ones. And what I also notice as well is, this kind of an aside tangent, but he's also into his conspiracy theories. For some reason, he's got a lot of family videos, which I didn't realise in the first playthrough. You know, he's got like, I think it's it's Sam and Kay, sorry, it's their wedding video. It's something to do with Dawn as well. It's a bit weird why he's got them. And of course, he's got the figures that turn up in his fantasy. But the reason I'm bringing him up is because he exhibits something which, quite frankly, I never really knew much of. And this isn't really a term that is scientific. Well, it's technically scientifically supported, but it's not recognised by any of the mental health boards or associations. But it's a concept called maladaptive daydreaming. And before I go on and talk a little bit more about this, Adam, did you ever hear about this concept?
I'd never heard about this until you brought it up a couple of days back.
And I started spamming you with like academic articles like the uni days of old.
I know it's different from the memes they usually send me.
That is true.
To get an academic meme, academic journal, meme.
Honestly, you guys should see like our messages together. Half of it's like a very serious, do you know what we should do? We should do this for the show. We should do that. I feel as if this would be a very mature approach. And the other one's like Gerald Robotnik memes.
So much Gerald Robotnik.
There really is. There's far too much than should be allowed. But anyway, so maladaptive daydreaming is a concept that was coined in 2002 by an Israeli psychologist called Eli Sommer. He basically had a very small trial group. So I just want to point this out, but he had a very small trial group of, I want to say about 6 people from like high trauma backgrounds. And you know, you can read the whole like article that he's put up on Google, but honestly it's a fascinating read. But basically the concept of maladaptive daydreaming is that your daydreaming gets so bad that you're basically daydreaming that you're part of a completely different world. The fact remains that although you kind of know that it's not reality, you become so obsessed and consumed with like this whole world that you've created for yourself. And usually it's a world where you're a figure of like high importance, you've got a lot of power. So it's basically detaching yourself from real life, because let's face it, in real life a lot of things will happen to you that are outside of your control. Honestly, you can't control everything in your life, but if you actually create a world of your own where, you know, you can control every single facet that comes through, then, you know, why would you want to return to the real world? And it's kind of a dangerous mindset, because it's kind of categorized as your inability to function in the real world because you're daydreaming so much. And this is something that ends up coming along in Lewis's story. So Lewis works in a cannery. Basically, he is in charge of grabbing a fish, throwing it under a guillotine, watching its head get chopped off, and then he throws it onto a conveyor belt. It's a very boring job, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very much kind of factory line manual work.
And I mean, we've all been there before, you know, where we've done a job, or even at school, university, we've done something where we just suddenly go on autopilot and our minds kind of drift. But throughout the story, it's kind of told through the perspective of Lewis's psychologist. And the psychologist basically explains how he was having these thoughts of grandeur as king of this land where everyone loved him and revered him. So much so that despite his mother begging and everything, he let himself get so consumed by this that he ended up committing suicide. It's heavily implied, rather, that he committed suicide because he decides to quote-unquote get crowned, where I have to admit, the first time I saw that, I could tell what he was going to put his head into, and I thought, I have seen enough French documentaries. I've seen Les Mis. I know what's going to happen here. I was like, Lewis, please don't. You know how it ends. That one, to me, that really took me back, because I was like, this is such a tragic story story. And again, I have to admit, there's one other I just want to touch on because I know you'll probably want to talk about it more in depth, but with a particular character called Walter, where I have to admit, I never really thought much of his story until I replayed it again. And after talking with you, Adam, and you explained how the implications of how brutal his life must have been. Honestly, it shook me thinking about it. And I thought, what a waste of life. And I don't mean that as an insult, like, oh, what a waste of space. I mean, genuinely, he wasted his life thinking that the world out there was out to get him. And then the first time he actually steps out, he just gets killed. And it's absolutely tragic. But kind of flipping it back onto you, Adam, what one stood out to you?
Lewis's story, you're completely right. I think Lewis's story is probably the standout of the whole game, I would say, because it's the perfect blend of gameplay and narrative. Justin, as you say, so basically, as you're doing the story, you both control Lewis as he's working in the cannery, slicing fish heads off and throwing them onto the conveyor belt, but you're also controlling his journey through this kind of fantasy land that he's creating. And it starts off being quite simple, so if you're playing it on like an Xbox controller, I presume a PlayStation controller as well, your kind of left thumbstick controls Lewis in the fantasy world, while the right thumbstick controls his hand in the real world, working in the cannery. And as you start out, the fantasy world's quite small. It only takes up like about the kind of top left corner of the screen, and most of it's the cannery setting. But as it goes on, this fantasy world becomes much more complex, and it starts to fill the screen until it's basically taken over the whole screen. But you can still see the fish coming into the cannery, and you still need to guide them and decapitate them and put them on the conveyor belt. So it's just such an excellent representation of that condition that you were talking about, maladaptive daydreaming. If you're ever looking for, I think, like a perfect blend of narrative and gameplay, I think Lewis's story is one of the best examples you could ever show up to show how to do that, how to make that kind of perfect blend of the two. This one's not my favorite, but I do think Barbara's story stylistically is also great. And so basically, Barbara she would have been Edith's great aunt. I can't think of the
great aunt. Yeah,
great aunt. Yeah, sorry, she would have been Edith's great aunt. And so basically, she was a famous child star. But then as she grew up, her star fell, and she fell out of acting, and she's working a pretty mundane job. Basically, her story takes place in Halloween, and it seems that somebody's broken into the house, and you play her like searching the house. And eventually you have to fight off a mystery attacker and everything. And it's basically when Edith gets into Barbara's room, she finds this kind of like pulpy comic book, kind of Halloween based one that like talking about her murder. And so basically you travel from like strip to strip on each of the pages as you flick through in your controller. And I think stylistically it looks really fascinating, as well. You've got the main theme from the Halloween film playing along back, and it really adds. I think it's an excellent sort of experience. Yeah, like Molly's. I think Molly's is a great one because Molly's is the first story you play, and it's a really like, as you said, it's like really like wow. You're playing as this little girl, and you first transform into a cat, and then you transform into an eagle. I think some kind of bird of prey, and then you're a shark, and then you end up as a sea monster. It's a fantastic like introduction. You're just like, whoa, as you say, like you think it's this going to be the rest of the game is going to be this really like kind of paranormal like tale, and it turns out not to be. But I think hers is such an excellent standout as a story. Perhaps like gameplay wise, Walter's isn't the most interesting because it's quite simple in what you're doing and stuff. But I think narratively, Walter is maybe one of my favorite characters just because I find his story like is particularly tragic. Do you think there's enough differentiation between each story? Do you think? Because again, like the gameplay's ever so slightly different, but again, it's not probably they're not never like that much different from each other. But did you think there was enough differentiation? Would you like to have seen a bit more?
I think there was definitely a lot of differentiation. You could certainly tell the stylistic differences, and it was kind of framed in a way of you could certainly feel as if you were in the character's shoes. As you said with Barbara, I have to admit, I think stylistically her chapter is probably one of the best because, as you said, she's this former childhood star and her quote-unquote death is reported in this very kind of trashy Tales from the Crypt kind of comic. I thought that was really well done. There were some that were a bit underwhelming, like the ones that come to mind are Calvin and Gus. I honestly struggled to remember them at times because theirs kind of, are over with in a flash. Same same with Walter. Like, if you're not really engaging in the game, then they're maybe not as memorable. I think maybe Walter stands out because by the time you actually get out, you literally get the story hitting you like a freight train. You do get a sense of difference with the characters, I would say. So, yeah, no, I would say so. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, like I think there is enough of a difference. Yes, for much as you're kind of doing similar actions, I think there's enough of a difference in either kind of the way it's styled or else in the kind of narrative kind of tones it's going for. You get the story of Edith's brother Milton, and then Edith's great 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 grandfather Odin, who's the original patriarch of the Finch family, and the man who moved the family to America by taking their house in Sweden and sailing it across the ocean. Just as they're in sight of land, a storm hits and Odin goes down with the original house, and so that they have to build a new house has to be built. But you can still see the old house popping out of the ocean just out from the shore. Basically, Odin's story is told through this kind of one of these old viewfinders, which if people don't know was kind of like a kind of plastic binocular set that you could put like slides into, and then you would click down a lever and it would move to the next one, move to the next kind of slide. While Milton's story is told through this flip book, which I think I really like Milton's the way it's done as well, because you can control how fast you go through the flip book and everything. You can go backwards and forwards like a real one. I really enjoy Milton's, and they're very simple, but they do break it up, and I think it's still a very effective way of telling both their stories, because again, we kind of get that it keeps Odin as this very mythical figure, and we don't really get a kind of a sense of who he was. It's very much from a different. He's like a marble man, basically. It's just a statue, really. That's all we kind of know about him. While Milton's the brother who's disappeared, and we don't know his fate. It's not confirmed that he's dead. It's presumed that he is, but his flip book is kind of him. He's an artist, and it's him creating this kind of door, painting this door that he's then able to go through. And it's this kind of a bit more fantastical. It's a bit more kind of in line with Molly's story. It's this kind of more fantastical element to it, and it kind of as a way of this character just having disappeared with no trace. I think there's enough. I'd agree with you. There's enough differentiation in there, I think, to kind of mark each character out. And one thing I love about this game is I think visually it's stunning. I absolutely love the way it looks. Like, the graphics maybe aren't the best, of any game out there, but I think they're perfect for what the game is. There's a great blend of color throughout the game, and again, that varies from story to story. Barbara's is there's quite a lot of pastely colors because it's a comic book, or something like Walter's is much more kind of monotone to reflect his life of kind of living in this bunker underground. And the house itself, can I say, like, as the game starts, you start at the kind of edge of this forest which leads up to the Finch house, and you can just see the top of the house poking through, and I think the house is absolutely stunning to look at. Architecturally, it's amazing. So you can see the kind of original house built, but it's been built on top of. As each family member dies, their room is kind of turned into this shrine for them, and nobody else uses it. So that meant for like Edith and her two brothers, they had to build completely new rooms on top of the house, so it keeps like stretching upwards into this kind of a natural structure. I really like it. Did you like the kind of visuals of the game?
I feel as if it was one of the highlights of the game, for sure. What I actually loved as well is this could have easily been one of those games that you walk through the rooms and then that's it. They tell a story, the story ends, that's it, absolutely gone. Yeah, what they did was they incorporated this kind of, I don't want to say puzzle finding gameplay. They made you go through secret tunnels, secret passages, and they really showcased the creativity throughout the game and how you could explore the house. So it wasn't a case of just walking up the stairs, it was more a case of being able to explore to your heart's content, and I thought it was really well done. And I thought the wee Easter eggs as well were absolutely fantastic. As I said before, with Lewis's room, you had the Alice in Wonderland stuff, you had the small figures that turn up in his daydreams, you had all these kind of small hints towards what influenced him. With Milton, you had all the artwork, you could see what influenced him. It was just spectacular. Personally, I thought it was done so well, and it told you so much about the characters. Like, one thing I want to point out, which I didn't realise in the first instance, was, do you remember Dawn's room? Well, Dawn, Gus, and Gregory's room.
Yeah.
In the corner of that room, there's like a board that says like 7 a.m, get up, 7:30, salute the flag and everything. And it's very regimented. And the whole room itself is like an army barracks. And I have to admit, I remember going through that room the first time thinking, why is it like this? Why isn't it as colourful as the other rooms? And then I realised because the father of those three children was Sam, who was the wee boy I was talking about earlier, who was really into the military, and he grew up as soon as he was 18. He left home, he became part of the military, then he became someone who was into hunting, so the fact that the army was always a part of his life also seeped into his family life. So his children literally lived like soldiers in that room. It's amazing how other characters' personalities seep into other rooms. I honestly think it's fantastic.
Yeah, as you say, it's just another example of how great the environmental storytelling is in this game. And exactly as you say, this is a game well worth replaying, I think, because you will pick up so much more and you will find so much more, and it just recontextualizes everything. It's just great. I know we were both talking about the swing set, not maybe realizing so much about the swing set the first time round, maybe not even noticing it, but it being such a prominent thing, kept seeing afterwards. And that's the swing set where Calvin dies, Sam's brother, as you mentioned earlier, and that being such an important thing in his life. Before we move on to kind of talk about the themes of the game, as one kind of final point here, let's talk a little bit about the characters themselves. Is there a particular member of the Finch family who you really struck a chord with you and you really found very fascinating?
Other than Lewis, who we've already kind of talked about in length, I honestly think Edie was quite interesting, I have to say, and I know we'll probably go on to her in the second half of this discussion, but the facts that she has lived through and surpassed, as it were, all of these generations of Finches under the presumption that they've all died because of this curse, I thought it was fascinating. I watched a video that is very popular. I really don't have to introduce it to many people because I think it's got like 4.2 million views as of this recording, and it was one that I recommended to you, which I think you've already seen it.
Yeah, it's a really good one.
It's a video that basically characterises Edie as being the villain of Edith Finch. Maybe not overall, like, not saying that she is like this mastermind that's been, cutting the strings of like the swing or, knocking Barbara over the head or anything, but indirectly affecting all these people's lives and kind of putting it under the reason of being, oh, it's a family curse, oh, there's nothing we can do about it kind of thing. And it almost felt like a coping mechanism. Like, are you okay with me to kind of talk about this bit?
Yeah, no,
before we move on?
let's get into it. I think this is a good kind of bridge into the themes.
With Edith, she initially, when I watched that video, I thought they made a fantastic point that throughout the entire game, she is saying how her family's affected by this terrible curse. And I have to admit, the first time I played this game, I totally bought into it. I was like, oh yeah, this is a curse. That girl was a cat. She's turned into like a man-eating octopus. This is a family curse. But then the more and more you play it, you obviously realise, okay, that's hyperbole. The monster under her bed is just jump ropes. And she's like taking all of these elements from around her, like the owl mask on the wall and the creature from below drawn on her wall. It's all like kind of different things. But with Edie, I did notice something interesting in her room, and I don't know if you picked up on this, Adam. In her room, where there's a kind of shrine to Odin?
Yeah.
And there's a bit where you can see there's two particular books. Now, I don't know if these books are like based on anything real or there's any excerpts from them, but there's two books in particular from Odin that are on his shrine. One of them's called The Mysteries of Death and Thereafter and Joining the Great Majority. Now, I don't know if this obsession with death goes even further back, because there is that kind of illusion that there was like a family graveyard and things from when Odin kind of travelled over, because they thought, that's it, we're cursed, we're going to move over. And then, of course, they ended up sinking with the old house. But I'm wondering if that's kind of continued from Odin. What I'm trying to say is, Edie's not the kind of catalyst for starting like a new curse. She's more like a torchbearer for it. I don't know if it's like survivor's guilt or it's, like you can see as well that Edie reads, there's a particular book on her bedside that's called, I think it's like Norwegian folk tales. And she's really into that kind of thing, like really exploring all these concepts. And you can tell she's certainly someone who is absolutely obsessed with death, having basically shrines of people in her house. I mean, look at Barbara's room, like going back to her. Her room actually has a cake in it that is from her 16th birthday. Did you know that?
I did not know that. I did not see that one at all. Wow.
Yeah, no, there's a cake that says Happy Birthday Barbara, and there's 16 holes in the cake, which makes me think it must have been for her 16th birthday.
Is that how old she is when she dies as well, isn't it? I think she's about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether that's a cake like they've brought in, and just left, or I don't know. It's just it's weird. There is like a lot more we can go into with Edie, but Edie was definitely the one that struck a chord with me. But one thing I did notice as well, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but she had like a origami shark near her bed.
They did real well.
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know if that's what influenced Molly, or if Molly already had like a toy shark or something. I don't know.
Maybe she read like Molly's like final diary entry.
Yeah. Of course, going off of one of your points that you brought up when I was replaying this game, the fact that she's got like all of these wooden pallets down in the basement ready to like draw the next Finch to die, that actually really shocked me because I never noticed it on the first playthrough.
Yeah, it's again one of these details that I only picked this up in my this must have been my fifth playthrough, I think, of the fourth or fifth playthrough, and it was only then that only in this one that I noticed that ominous pile of logs, of the sliced logs down in the basement.
But yeah, was there any particular character you felt an affinity towards?
Edie is particularly fascinating, and what I find fascinating as well is when I first played the game, I saw Edie as a very sympathetic character, and because there's kind of a struggle throughout the game that Edith narrates, basically between Edie and Edith's mother Dawn, and Edie's very much the one who believes in this curse and wants the details of the family and their deaths to be memorialized and remembered, and Dawn's very much the more kind of pragmatic one who wants to move on and kind of get away from this because she sees the damage, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this soon. But I kind of saw Edie as a very sympathetic character and Dawn as a more villain of the piece, but on subsequent playthroughs and after watching that video that you mentioned before, which was done by a creator called Joseph Anderson, just to give them their credit, which is a really good video, and I'd highly recommend watching it after you play the game, really made me see Edie in a very different light. So I totally agree that she's a fascinating character. I think the more I play it, the more I'm drawn to Walter as a character. So Walter is one of the sons of Edie, and it would have been Edith's great uncle. And so basically what happens is Walter, I can't remember how old Walter is at the time, but basically as a young boy, it's implied that he witnesses the death of his sister Barbara on that kind of fateful Halloween night. And this basically traumatizes Walter, and he becomes so paranoid of death and so convinced that he's going to die that he basically flees the house and flees above ground and takes refuge in this kind of shelter that's built under the house. And that's where he stays for the next, I think, is about 50 years or something. That maybe it's more than that. He stays underground in the shelter, and that's his whole world. And his story, as you play his story basically revolves around you doing the monotonous task of opening a can of peaches every day, and then the calendar changes, and years go by, and you start off in the 60s, then you're into the 70s, and then it goes to the 90s, and it's just he's writing this journal, and you can hear his fear, and he's so terrified of death. And then eventually, as you say, he just realizes that he wants to get out, and he wants to experience the world again, come what may, and he tunnels his way out, and unfortunately right into a railway line where he's run over by this train. It's a tragic story in itself, but the more I play about it, and the more I just think about what happened to this boy and then this man and everything, and how just traumatized he must have been from that night and what it did to him. And the fact that, in a way, Edie knows that Walter's there under the house. I think the rest of the family, Edith doesn't know, because Edith perhaps is shocked at discovering that Walter was under there, because Walter dies when she's quite young, not long after Edith's been born. But I think the other family members know he's under there, but nobody does anything to help him. Everybody just kind of leaves him there and just lets him sort of, retreat away into this kind of isolation. I find that so tragic the more I think about it, and the more I play the game, and it's just that nobody tries to help him, and he does have such a tragic life where he just hides away until, unfortunately, the minute he just breaks out. It's interesting that he breaks out. He doesn't come out the door of the shelter, because you go down, you basically descend into the basement, and then that leads you into the shelter where Walter is. He doesn't come out that way. He tunnels through the wall and goes to the outside, which is just unfortunately onto this railway tracks he doesn't know about. And it's just the whole thing is so tragic, and I just find myself drawn more and more to Walter and just his experience as something that just particularly tragic and kind of melancholic.
This is probably me getting a bit too personal here, but as someone as well who, when I was younger, I have to admit, learning about the concept of death and kind of the fact that basically everyone bar Walt Disney who's in his immortal freezer, apparently. Is that aged or?
I don't know, I still think it's funny.
The fact that when I was younger, learning about death and everything, and it really, even today, I don't think so much for me it's a fear of death, but more like a fear of the unknown, because obviously we could be here for hours talking about the different, theories about what happens after you die and everything, and it is like a really daunting concept for a lot of people, and I can only imagine what this character Walter was feeling at the time, seeing his own sister killed in front of him, the fact that he ran downstairs and, he never left since. And I have to admit, a lot of people do suffer from that. There's like loads of people who suffer from things like agoraphobia, for example, that they feel as if they cannot leave the familiar walls of their own house or their flat or wherever they live, because they think, if I step outside, something bad's going to happen to me. Going back to what you were saying about Edie, this is something that did turn me against her, because initially I was totally with you. Do you know what it reminded me of? It's a bit like, see when you watch a film when like you're a young child and you watch a film, you're like, oh yeah, screw those people, screw those adults, these kids are having fun. And then, when you watch the film as an adult, you have a completely different perspective and you're just like, damn, those kids are dicks. That way. And that's what it felt like with Edie, because first time playing through this, I did think of Edie as, this poor old woman who, she suffered from this terrible family curse. And then once I went back and replayed it, I was like, hold on a minute. She knew that he was underground and she went out of her way to like secretly, and that's what they said, because she never told Edith at all. And I doubt she told the rest of her family about it. But when you go down to the basement, it is chock-a-block, filled with cans of peaches, cereal, just everything. And the fact that she was enabling this behaviour, I don't know, like, maybe I'm jumping the gun on a discussion a bit here, but would you say the family curse could potentially be an offshoot of Edie having some kind of mental illness?
Yeah, I think so. I tell you, let's move into this makes a nice kind of pathway into the second part of this. Let's talk about some of the themes of the game. I definitely think there's a strong case that you say that this is perhaps some kind of mental illness on the part of Edie. I think this is mentioned in that video that we talked about, kind of the one titled "The Villain of Edith Finch," where if you look at Molly's death, so obviously Odin's the first one to die, but in a way, the death that really seems to have the biggest effect, particularly for Edie, seems to be Molly, and Molly being the first story that we play in, or the oldest of Edie's children, but the first to die, and she dies when she's 10 years old. And basically what happens with Molly is that one evening, for whatever reason it is, we can presume that Molly maybe misbehaved or whatever, but Molly is basically sent to bed without any dinner, and she gets up and she's really hungry, and she tries to get out, but Edie won't let her out, so she begins to look around her room for things to eat, and so she ends up eating some of her gerbils food, she eats toothpaste, and then she eats these kind of berries off this mistletoe that's kind of adorning the bathroom, and then she ends up having these kind of, I guess, hallucinations where she turns into a cat and a shark and things like that, and then she dies that very night, and it seems to basically be that she dies from kind of the poison effect of those berries. This is this was never clearly Edie's intention, but the death definitely falls under parental neglect, I think, is what we could term this, and that seems to have had such a catastrophic effect on her psyche that in a way she can't, it's such a horrible, to confront that reality that your actions directly led to the death of your child, is such a traumatic thing that almost in a way to protect herself, this is when the whole legacy of the curse really takes off for Edie in particular. She mythologizes it, and then it becomes this thing, almost celebrates the wrong word, but it's almost this, it's this thing that makes the Finch family famous. And we hear a lot of things during the game. We see a lot of things where she talked to newspapers and the stuff about elements of the curse and the more kind of fantastical elements around the Finch family. And so I think you're totally right in that we could maybe look at this as a kind of mental illness in a way, and just an attempt to disassociate from the reality by kind of really making this fiction around the curse. If we want to see the curse as more fictional than actual being truthful.
It definitely takes a kind of spiritual role, doesn't it? It's almost as if it's like, it's not just death, it's, God, this is like a Marks and Spencer's advert, this isn't just death. It is an Edith Finch death. It does feel like this kind of mystical, oh look, it's not my fault. Like as you said, it's parental neglect, but by Edith actually saying that, how was I supposed to know? It's just the curse. That's why Molly died. It wasn't because she decided to send her upstairs without any food and she locked the door so she couldn't escape. The same with like Walter. It's like, oh, it's not my fault he was hiding in the basement. Oh, it's not my fault. That is actually one that disturbed me. I think the Barbara one disturbs me a little bit more than some of the others because she has as we talked about, she has the comic, doesn't she? That's like proudly displayed on the shrine. And that just seems weird. That's like if either of us passed away and to kind of celebrate our like legacy, we had like this kind of, I don't know, like, it's like if I turned up to your funeral, you turned up to mine, and we both started saying like the Gerald Robotnik speech. It'd be like totally inappropriate. And obviously it's like it's not the case. So it's like, why would you have something like this?
It becomes more disturbing as well when you consider that likely Edie had some involvement in the version of the story that's in the comic, because the layout of the Finch house is exactly how it is. And there's also the detail about how you get into the basement through the kind of music box puzzle, which is details that only a family member would know. So that adds it's never explicit. This is kind of implied that we can maybe think that perhaps she had some involvement with providing the story, which adds another level of quite horrific extra subtext to this.
And you feel sorry for Barbara because even Edith comments that whenever she's asked about her family, the first person they ask about is Barbara because she was a childhood star who featured in all these like really, quite frankly, like these stereotypical films about Bigfoot for the kind of, is it the 50s?
Yeah, it looks like, like late 40s, early 50s.
Yeah, and it just looks like a Planet Hollywood kind of museum. It doesn't really look like the room of a teenage girl, if that makes sense. Like some bits do, but it's all adorned and do you know what I mean? Like the kind of past trappings of an actress. But by that point, when she turned 16, she was no longer really relevant anymore, and no offence to Barbara. But, it's like she was almost treated as like a commodity because you can see her boyfriend, especially, who is, he's a piece of work. But, he treats her more like he treats her more like an actress, if that makes sense, rather than being a supportive partner. Like, even when Sven gets his finger cut off, and that's Barbara's father. So Edie and Sven go to the hospital to get it fixed. And the boyfriend hears like a scream and he jokingly says, very apathetically, he goes, oh yeah, you should scream like that. Not saying like, oh, are you okay, Mr. Finch, or anything. No. He just like straight up says that. And you're like, that is weird. It's just like such a weird relationship they have, coupled with the fact that you'll never know how she actually died in the game. There's a truth out there of how Barbara died, but as you said, it's clear that Edie definitely worked with them, gave this elaborate story about, how she died because of all these monsters. And there's several theories, because I'm curious to hear what camp you fall into, but there's like theories that the boyfriend did it, that it was crazed fans that broke in, it was like a gang of people trying to rob the house that killed her. Where do you fall on that one?
I personally think it's the boyfriend. Well, as well, because we find the intro, he's never found. So to me, it implies that he did it and then he disappears. Again, you can read it. So basically, the kind of first half of the story is basically what happens is the boyfriend goes in the basement and then he goes missing. And so Barbara ventures down to try and find him. And he basically jumps out to scare her, to try and get her to like get her famous scream back. And then she ends up like throwing him out of the house at that point. So I look at that as perhaps, she tried, the first bit is true and that she tried to throw him out and then some kind of scuffle ensued and then who knows what happened. I think then he likely killed her then, whether it was intentional or one of these accidental, but that's kind of the camp I fall into. What about yourself?
I would probably agree with you, because the thing is, going back in the theory of the monsters being like rabid fans, I don't know if that's like Edie's own projection onto the way that America treated Barbara. Like they welcomed her in as a friend, and as soon as they got her, they turned immediately and they tore her apart and everything. And I don't know, like I don't think that's probably what happened. Obviously the monsters didn't happen, and don't think it was maybe crazed fans. And I just want to point out, this is the closest we'll ever get to a true crime episode, by the way.
For now, certainly.
Oh, absolutely. But yeah, no, I would say the boyfriend probably did it. Because again, it's like the retelling is just so filled with so much, emphasis and fantastical elements that you really just can't tell, can you?
Yeah, it is that blend, and it really comes back to that idea about this curse being true for fiction, and as you say, like what is true, what's not, what's exaggerated, what's not. To me, one of the big themes of this game is the fact of how people, deal with grief and deal with loss, and the kind of the impact of trauma, and you can see that on basically most of the characters in the game. So obviously we've discussed how Edie very likely disassociates from her own actions and kind of makes this, really mythologizes this curse as a way to deal with what's happening rather than kind of confronting the truth. We see Walter fleeing down, to the bunker to deal with the trauma of likely witnessing his sister's death. As well, like Barbara's other brothers, Sam and Calvin, you can see they clearly affected by the trauma. It's quite interesting. I don't know if you remember when it comes to Calvin's story, and basically we learn about Calvin's story through this poem that his twin brother Sam writes, and it talks about, I think it starts off with them talking about the effects of Barbara's funeral, and they both made this pact to each other never to be afraid again. So they kind of have the opposite reaction to Walter, who very much embraces the fear. Calvin particularly, fights against it, and that's why he gets on his swing and he's determined to, do a complete 360 loop on the swing, and he ends up doing it, but it ends up it ends up resulting in him flying off the swing, and the swing is placed precariously near this cliff, and so he flies down and falls to his death. And so again, that's a kind of effect of trauma. And then we see his brother Sam, as you say, who has to live for I think about 8 years in this room that's he had to share with his brother, and then he has to share with his brother's ghost, virtually, and half is roped off. And then he said as soon as opportunity, he as quickly as he can, he joins the military and goes away. And then he has a very kind of, even when he comes back, you can see the effect that these, as much as he tries to present himself as a very stoical, kind of emotionally repressed figure, you can tell this is likely a result of the trauma of losing Calvin and losing Barbara, and then as well obviously Walter's disappearance. Whether he knows where Walter's gone or not, he very much tries to just kind of repress his emotions. But we can see a lot. If you look a lot, he's an avid photographer, Sam, and you can see lots of his photos scattered around. Lots of the photos are of the swing set, after still coiled up around the tree after Calvin had fallen from it. So you can see what an effect that had. And even as well, when he's described, when we get to Gregory's story, the way we experience it is through a letter that Sam writes to his ex-wife, Kay, Kay was there with with Gregory at the time, and she kind of leaves Gregory unattended to speak to Sam on the phone call as they're kind of going through, I think, a divorce at that time. And then he writes this letter where he kind of eulogizes Gregory, and in this way, kind of, there's no way he kind of makes his version of Gregory. There's no way of knowing, because Gregory was so young when he died, and he talks about, he reminded me so much of Calvin and everything, and you can just see this constant trauma affecting him. And then we have Dawn, one of Sam's children, who very much rejects the curse and is very much trying to get away from it, because she can see the harm that it's doing, especially when her children start to die from the effects of being in this family and the kind of grim reality. Because basically these characters are living in a graveyard. The Finch household is basically a graveyard if you think about it, because we have these rooms that the minute somebody dies are turned into shrines and they can't be used anymore. So that's why the house has to be built vertically up and new rooms have to be put on. You can only imagine growing up in this environment, and I think it's just an interesting look at how people deal with grief and deal with loss. Is there any kind of themes that you really found coming through this game?
Well, just kind of going off on that point you just said there about being surrounded by death, there's actually a line that Edith says where when you're walking through the cemetery, she actually points out that the cemetery was built before the house was finished. So you're totally right. Death is basically a core theme of both the house itself and the game as a whole, because even when you go into Edie's room, have you noticed that when you look in the cages, or the bird cages, she actually has pictures of the animals in the cages? So it's almost exactly what she's doing for her own family members. Again, going back to what you were saying, it's really spooky when you go into the basement and you see all of these plaques of wood just ready to be painted for the next Finch. It is really daunting when you look at that and you think, wow, this is very unsettling. But I think you're right. Death is the core theme of this game and the different reactions to it, how to deal with it. Because I have to admit, being someone who's nearly 30, I have seen my fair share of people who have passed away in my life. And one of the ones that's always stood out to me is a boy that I didn't really know very well in school. I remember one day he was a boy who lived nearby me, and when I was walking home, this boy struck up a conversation with me, and we started talking about random things, and then he went his way, I went my way, and then I found out a week later that he had just suddenly dropped dead from a heart attack. And throughout my life, like whether they've been old or young, you always get people in your life that they're going to pass away. That is the inevitability of life, which I know that's a bit grim for an episode of Satsunami, but it's a sad kind of fact of life that one day people die, and that's kind of how it is. And throughout this game, they explore it in different ways, and I have to admit, I appreciate their kind of brutal honesty towards it. Like for example, they don't shy away from, as much as it's kind of controversial, they don't shy away from Gregory drowning in the bathtub. And obviously they don't do it like in a very gratuitous way, but they do it just enough that they leave you disturbed thinking, oh my god, this poor child. And the fact as well that when you go into his room, you realise that Gregory shared a room with Dawn and Gus, and Dawn had to actually sleep in between Gregory's cot and Gus's bed as well, which I think must have been so traumatic for that poor woman. I know she's a character, but that must have been so traumatic. And you see like all the different takes on death. Like there's ones that are very explicit, like Sven getting crushed by the dragon, even though Edie fluffs it up as Sven fighting the dragon. At the end of the day, he was crushed tragically by a dragon. But then you get other ones like Milton, who I think technically he survived, but if we're looking in the kind of perspective of Edith Finch and not, is it the Unfinished Swan?
Yeah, so the Unfinished Swan was Giant Sparrow's first game, which has some links to What Remains of Edith Finch.
Well, if you look at Milton's character and you assume that, he passed away as well, life doesn't always give you kind of a tidy, neat conclusion to people, especially when it comes to death. Like, Milton in the game is never found. And Dawn, I think that's one of the things that starts to push her away from the idea of the family curse and away from Edie as a whole. Because something I found quite interesting was, if you actually look in the, the homeschool that she set up,
yeah.
There's actually, this honestly completely skipped me by when I first played this, but there's actually a project that she set her kids where she actually taught them about the curse of the Finch family. And although she's got on her board like this poster about the scientific theory, or scientific method, there's this kind of emphasis on scientific rationale. She's also got like another poster that says family history, fact or fiction. It seems kind of weird how even she's buying into it, if that makes sense initially, until she loses two of her sons in the most tragic ways. Because I think that Edie and Dawn lose their children in very similar ways, in the sense that for Milton, she'll never know what happened. And maybe for Walter, Walter's kind of the equivalent, like she probably wouldn't have known what happened until she came down and saw that he'd been hit by the train. In terms of Lewis, you could honestly compare Lewis to probably Molly, I would say, both of which were out of their hands, if that makes sense. Like Edie, although obviously Edie was wrong to lock Molly in a room, and it was wrong of her not to feed her, so she turned to that. She couldn't have controlled that child's actions, she probably couldn't have predicted that she would have gone straight for the toothpaste or the berries, or, and it's the same with Dawn, that although she did everything she could to get Lewis into the cannery factory, get him a stable job, to get him away from the drugs and everything, the fact he was a grown 21-year-old man who was doing this monotonous job over and over and over again, creating this fantastical world, which was so much more appealing compared to his, his life in the factory. And it's absolutely tragic because despite Dawn trying to bring some kind of like rationale and reason into our children's heads about the family curse, they still lost their lives. Well, except for Edith, who, yeah, we all know that she kind of survives until the very end, but Dawn was the one to kind of outright reject. Is that right in saying that Dawn's probably the one who outright rejects the family curse?
I think she definitely does. I mean, she definitely views it as something that is directly or indirectly causing subsequent deaths. And there's a reason, actually, after Milton's disappearance, she basically, when you go into the Finch house, all the rooms are boarded up, basically. There were locked doors, so you have to kind of find alternate routes to get into them initially. And that was apparently what Edith's mother did after Milton's disappearance, because she clearly views, this family history as something that's causing, whether it's directly causing it or indirectly, it's making people more reckless or whatever, or, leading them to these unfortunate fates. And as you journey through, you can see that Milton has clearly been to a lot of these rooms, because you can find a lot of his drawings and paintings on a lot of the walls. And it does make you wonder if whether, as he researched these stories, he maybe had a similar reaction to Walter and tried to basically flee by trying to get away as far as possible. So it makes you wonder if perhaps he had a kind of traumatic reaction to learning this and the kind of fear of what was in store for him. I guess we'll never really know if Dawn totally rejects it, whether she truly believes it's not real, or whether she just sees the kind of the negative impact it's having, is determined to resist it and fight against it, eventually to the point where she takes Edith, her last remaining child, away, and they get as far away as they can until, unfortunately, Dawn is diagnosed, unfortunately, with cancer and dies shortly after that, leaving just Edith. But yeah, definitely, she definitely is the one who has, certainly in comparison to Edie, who very much embraces this curse, whether it be real or not. Dawn is very much the kind of antithesis of that.
I've got a question for you about Edith in particular. See, despite the fact that she hasn't been told any of this, do you think it's actually changed her to become someone better or completely different compared to the run-of-the-mill Finch?
At the end of the day, I think she exhibits a lot of those same tendencies, because we don't find out straight away, we find out maybe halfway into the game, maybe slightly under halfway in the game, that Edith is, I think, 22 weeks pregnant at the time that she's back at the house. She is doing activities that you probably shouldn't do at that stage of a pregnancy. She is doing a lot of climbing, a lot of precarious. There's a bit where she could, a point where she kind of precariously walks across a tree branch. Things that you definitely should not be doing. At that stage, for your own health and for your unborn child's health. So there's a lot of that kind of Finch recklessness, which goes all the way back to Odin. Shipping his house across and then refusing to abandon it when it's sinking and leading to his demise. For as much as perhaps she is a bit different, I think you can definitely see that kind of Finch DNA in there. And I think it's probably just a byproduct of having grown up in this sort of bizarre world surrounded by death. And I think you're completely right in pointing out that death is the major theme of this game, and how we deal with it, and how a lot of people need to find meaning, because that is a human reaction, to find meaning for death. And why did this happen? We can't always accept the randomness and the chance of death. We sometimes want to find a reason and a method to the madness. But what I really appreciate about this game as well, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on it, is I really admire how this game deals with death compared to how most video games deal with death. And death is, in my opinion, usually quite a flippant thing in video games. It's, to be honest, it's usually the prime objective of the player in a lot of video games is to deal death, or else death is something that's only given meaning to certain characters, so to names characters and to high profile characters, like in the Modern Warfare series, God knows how many people die in the course of those games, but really the death that's given a big emotional weight is, and slight spoilers here, is Soaps in Modern Warfare 3. That's a death we're really meant to care about, not the thousands who have died before that. But what do you think about how this game kind of deals with death compared to kind of other video games?
I think it's very refreshing, to be honest, because don't get me wrong, I don't think a lot of other video games, for example, you brought up Call of Duty there, I definitely think that if they took an Edith Finch approach, can you imagine how long that game would be?
The moralising would go on.
It's like Jim, yes, I shot him, his brother Tom. It's like, oh god, going to get through 30,000 games. It's like, yeah, I'd like to see a speedrun of that. I honestly think it's a breath of fresh air compared to some of these games, because you're completely right. These games do treat death as more of a system rather than a story beat. And usually in these kind of games, you don't really get to see death unless it's like a villain that gets killed, or it's like a particular character that you're supposed to feel emotional about. Like, for example, even in the Gears of War series, going into another FPS, it's like spoilers, but like Dom's death and that, you're supposed to feel really sad. And don't get me wrong, you still do, but with Edith Finch, you almost feel a bit like and pardon my phrasing for this, but you feel as if you're a bit of a voyeur, don't you? You're peeping through, like, literally these peepholes. You're looking into, like, snippets of people's lives. I actually remember when I went to visit, I think it was Scarabray in Orkney, and nearby there's like a huge manor house you can go in. In it, there's like a room where I don't know the official name, but like the lady of the house used to live in this room, and like her bathroom's been preserved, and like her room's been preserved, and she's got all of these like items scattered around the room. Thinking back to that moment, it kind of reminds me a little bit of, like, when you go into the bathroom for Edith Finch.
Yeah.
And, it's like the bright pink. Surprisingly enough, I think that bathroom was pink, but that's completely unrelated. But yeah, it's like the bright pink bathroom and everything, and it's this snippet of someone's life. And it genuinely got me thinking, and it's the same with Edith Finch, you go into these people's rooms and you almost feel like an outsider. Like, especially since Edith is supposed to be a family member. She's not an outsider. She's not the delivery man or woman. She is the youngest and last member of the Finch family. Well, technically, but you know what I mean. She isn't someone who should be considered as an outsider, yet as you go throughout the game, that's almost what it feels like. It feels as if you have been purposely kept outside. And I feel as if, like, the way they incorporate death into it is absolutely fantastic, because, as I said before, death in life comes in many ways, and especially in this game, they explore everything from tragic, infant accidents to trying to, conquer your fears and succumbing to that. One of the ones that actually intrigued me was Sam's death, which I don't think we've talked about yet, but as we said before, Sam saw his whole family, like his brothers and sisters, all die due to like really horrible accidents. Molly died because she ate too many berries. Calvin died because he swung around the tree branch, which, did you know Sam's in Calvin's scene?
Is he? Can you actually see him? Because I know you can hear him. You can hear him kind of running away.
Yeah, he's like at the very beginning when you're swinging, you can actually see him at the corner.
Oh, nice.
And then when he yells to his mum that he's coming inside, he runs away. But yeah, he was there for that, which technically you could also attribute maybe a thing of survivor's guilt, because he does kind of say that if he hadn't goaded him and said, "Oh, I bet you can't do that," then maybe he wouldn't have done it. So maybe there's that kind of guilt, and like reinforced by all the pictures of the swing sets and everything. I honestly, out of the four of them, between Molly, Calvin, Barbara and him, I feel as if his is probably the most ironic of deaths, because as you said, he is like a soldier who basically their job is to look for death and to go out and put themselves in the line of fire, and somehow he survived all of that only to be killed by just a random hunting accident. And it's the most random thing ever. And that's the thing, it also links back to a sense of realism, because life isn't always going to be point A to point B. It's not going to be, again, a typical video game where you go from point A to B and, oh no, I've died, let me respawn and everything. It treats it with a lot of reverence, I would say. Like, would you agree that it treats death with a respect compared to other video games?
Oh yeah, like each death is given weight here. It's not a trivial thing like it is in a lot of other video games. Each death is given the weight and the significance that these events deserve. I think as well, because we don't get to know everything about these characters, but we do get to inhabit their shoes. When you said I think you had an excellent point when you talked about it being voyeuristic. Like the game really is in that way, because we are inhabiting. Not only are we kind of peeping through the peepholes, to look upon these characters, but we're inhabiting their very last kind of moments on Earth. There is something very kind of voyeuristic about it, and the way it deals with death and that sort of way of looking at it, and then dealing with it, and then seeing how other people deal with it and rationalize it, I think is really, really remarkable and is something I think to be celebrated in video games. And linking back to a discussion we had a little while back with friend of the show, Craigie C from the Beer and Chill podcast, when we talked about mature content in video games, I would list this game as a mature game. There's not blood or gore or anything like that in this, but it deals with such lofty and such weighty issues that we'll have to confront at some point in our lives, as you say, that I think it really makes it a fascinating experience and something that really is very thought-provoking. As we kind of come to a close here, is there any kind of last themes that you saw in this game? Anything else you want to mention?
One thing I kind of want to point out, and it's going back to our discussion on Walter. I was just going to ask you, did you notice something in particular about his gravestone?
Is it got a train on it, or is that his memorial that has the train?
Yeah, that's his memorial.
Train,
yeah, but if you go to his gravestone in the Finch Cemetery, you see a moment where you kind of look through and you can see they've got like a tiny version of him looking out to the ocean. Now, I have to admit, initially when I looked at that the first time, I kind of thought, oh, that's lovely, he's forever looking out. But then the second time, after I watched that video and I looked into Edie a bit more, it's like, do you not think it's almost as if it's like him being trapped there forever, always looking out into the world that he can never be in?
That's an excellent point. I think that is a perfect encapsulation of Walter's life, honestly.
And I don't know, it gave me kind of shivers thinking, yeah, as you said, like I never really gave it much thought the first time, but going back to it, I thought, poor guy, like genuinely really poor guy. I suppose the other theme, just before we close off, as you said, but the other theme I just want to point out is the theme of inevitability and how we deal with it, because as you said, the theme of death is the central theme here, but there's also a theme of inevitability towards certain like fates, as it were, whether you want the inevitability to be just something normal, like everyone's going to die, to this kind of grandiose, oh, it's going to be a curse. I think that's a really fascinating look, and it's certainly interesting to see how adaptive each person is in the family, because you don't really get to see Kay or Sanjay's perspective on it all, really. I suppose for obvious reasons Kay probably would have left after what happened with Gregory, but you don't really get to see their kind of outsider perspective, which is quite interesting to defer that role to Edith, as we were talking about there. But like, is there anything you would say?
I think maybe one other thing, kind of two themes that come through in this game as well are issues to do with family and also kind of living with the past, and they're kind of related to the things we talked about living with loss and confronting death. But the very fact that this Finch household is a mix basically between a graveyard and a museum in many ways, and every new member of the Finch family is growing up directly next to the memories of their ancestors, those who've passed before them. And maybe some people live in circumstances like that, I don't know, but we don't usually live to that extent, with our past and with our family's past. But we all do, to an extent, live with the legacy of our family, through stories we hear, through objects that might still be with us, with also, with memories we have of family members. So, I think that's an interesting theme as well, and what we think about the past, how we deal with it, and how we live with it, how we choose to memorize. Do we mythologize it? Do we try and shun it and push it away? Do we just forget about it? I think that's kind of interesting themes as well. But I think the main one is clearly death. And then for me as well, it's that kind of dealing with grief and loss and the impact of trauma are the ones that really come through with this game. So kind of as a closing point, is there any kind of closing remarks you'd like to say about this game? Any way you kind of want to sum it up?
I mean, I know we've gone through and absolutely spoiled this game rotten, but yeah, if you haven't played this game, then I would 110% recommend this game. This is one of those games that I would say wouldn't really strike you the first time. It's one of those games that you have to like sit with you, kind of mature within yourself, and then you kind of think, all right, okay, I'm ready to go back and look at what I've missed, because there was a lot I missed in the first playthrough. And I wouldn't usually say that, because you know what people are like nowadays. They want that kind of good first impression impression. And this game isn't your kind of stereotypical, oh, we're going to go in, we're going to, show you all these bombastic set pieces. There's some beautiful pieces in this game, don't get me wrong, but it's not an action game, except for maybe Barbara's side tangent bit, but that's more a horror game, which, don't get me wrong, that actually really creeped me out. Like, did that creep you out the first time you played that?
Oh god, yeah, it still gives me a bit of creeps, to be honest, when I play it, but it really did kind of freak me out, because it's very different from, what you've kind of done previously.
It's honestly a fantastic narrative experience, and I would wholeheartedly recommend it. The thing that kind of holds me back from recommending it, though, and I don't know if you feel the same way, is there's a lot of heavy themes in this game. As I said before, for a lot of the game, there are a good number of children that die in this game. You've got Molly, you've got Calvin, you've got Gus as well. God forbid, you've got Gregory, who is probably the youngest character to die in this game. And it's quite an emotionally taxing game, I would say. But if you're looking for something different, and as you said, Adam, I think you're completely right, this is a mature game, and it doesn't need to have over-the-top swearing, it doesn't need to have over-the-top gore, it just has a very small, intimate story between family members, and I think it does it fantastically. I would happily pay for this game again.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really say ditto to all you've said above. I said at the beginning that this is one of my favorite games of all time. I absolutely love it. I absolutely adore it. I constantly come back to it, and I do believe it is well worth coming back to, because you're going to constantly be finding new things, and just more layers are going to be added onto this story. Again, it's a short experience, but it's really a memorable one. And I find the game so thoughtful, so melancholic, and I do find it very deeply moving, despite how short it is, and despite the fact that as a game, it's quite limited in terms of what you're doing. The gameplay is very limited. To me, it doesn't bother me. I think it's perfect for what it needs to be, and yeah, I just really adore it. You're completely right, though. There has to be some kind of advisory warnings for this. It is dealing with a lot of heavy themes, and there is a lot of potentially kind of triggering events in this game, and if you don't feel you can handle that, I completely understand. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I completely understand that. But if you do think you can confront these things and handle it, I think it's well worth experiencing this game. As Satsunami said earlier, it's on Game Pass. If you have that, go check it out. It's well worth that. And I think as well, it's usually on sale. You usually find it on sale. You can get it on PC and PlayStation. So I think it's been ported to Switch recently as well. So it doesn't cost that much compared to most other games. I think it's well worth its price. It usually retails at about £15 or something like that. I think it's well worth the price of admission, because it's something that will stay with you. I really do fundamentally believe that it is an experience that stays with you, and it provokes thought, makes you consider. You can see how it was both of us. We both went away and thought about it, continued to think about it, look things up, analyze the game further. I think it's amazing. I think it's a wonderful experience. So I would completely recommend this to everybody who thinks they can kind of handle what's in the game. So that being said, well, thank you so much, Tatsunami, for first of all for playing this game, for listening to me badger on about it for so long. Thank you for playing it, and thank you for doing all the research you did an absolute wealth of research this one. So thank you so much for digging into this and for sharing your thoughts.
Oh no, thank you for introducing me into the world of Edith Finch, and apologies again for bombarding you with all the research that I had, because honestly, I'll probably post it on Twitter, but I've got a whole load of notes on my phone being like, if you look at Lewis's gravestone, you can see he's got a crown on it. If you see this and that, God forbid, what you must have been thinking, oh God, Satsunami, I'm trying to sleep, it's 3 a.m. It's that meme where it's the guy with the pillow over his ears and he's trying to get to sleep, and then there's the picture in the window. Yeah, you can imagine it's you trying to get to sleep and me just at the window. Do you want to hear my latest Edith Finch theory? Number 1, Edith was the bad guy the entire time.
No, honestly, it was fascinating because you were picking up so many details that I hadn't even picked up, and that's what I think is another great thing about this game. I think people are going to come away with different things. As much as the story's the same, I think people are going to find different things and then you'll be like, oh, I never even saw that, but then you'll say something and probably that person probably never saw that. So it's a great game for provoking discussion. Again, that's maybe some of the highest praise we can give it. It's a game that you'll want to share with other people, and I think is well worth sharing.
Yeah. And sorry, that was the last point I wanted to bring up. I'm closing down the file now. Okay, that is me, Edith Finch free. Okay.
Finished out.
Yeah, but honestly, Adam, it was such a pleasure playing this game. It was a lot of fun to play through. It was thought-evoking. It was just a fantastic experience. So thank you for encouraging me to play this game.
Oh, well, I'm glad I picked a winner. That's all I can say. And at least if I've recommended at least one good game to you, so I can rest easy now. I don't have to worry about the mountain of failures that may result from other recommendations I make. So I got Edith Finch at least. I had a home run with that one.
Well, I mean, considering I recommended you a month of Sonic.
I enjoyed my month. I mostly enjoyed my month with Sonic, so you got a winner there.
Yeah, you just throw as many games at the wall as you can.
One of them's good.
And one will stick.
Oh dear. So anyway, we'll bring our discussion to a close there. So thank you again, Satsu, for all your work and for bringing so much to this discussion and really provoking a lot of thoughts. And honestly, I want to go back and play this again now. After all the stuff you brought up, I want to find all these details you were mentioning that I hadn't found. So there we go. Again, I'm maybe go back and have another one more trip through the Finch household.
Well, I'm going to pull a needy right now, and I'm not going to stop you.
Throw open the doors to me. Let me explore at will. So thank you once again, Satsu, for all your work, and thank you to everyone who's listening. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode. But until then, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly, stay hydrated.